Fantastic. Okay, great. Yeah, I just flew in from New York City. I was there for a few weeks visiting family. A little bit, pandemic was driving me a little crazy. We all took the opportunity. Everybody got vaccinated. Grandparents and everyone is safe and healthy, so we had to spend some time together. And with that, yeah, if we can go to the next slide, I can get rolling with it. There's a little bit of history there as to why I went to New York City. So, again, thank you for having me. I was born in Ecuador. Like many of you, I'm an immigrant. I've lived, my mom had to kind of leave. She left the country for economic reasons and personal reasons, and was always like seeking out better opportunities for us. Right. I left Ecuador when I was about 4 years old, and the arrows that kind of point here, there was a little bit of a back and forth between some of these places, but I did grow up and spent most of my childhood in Puerto Rico, and I did high school in New York City, went to University of Michigan, which I'll get into in a moment, and ultimately ended up in LA. Now I have around this time, about 4 years to be exact. And, I'm at NASA JPL, and I'll talk about what I do in detail. And it's been a fantastic experience working on the Mars 2020 mission over the last few years, many aspects of the mission, both on perseverance and ingenuity. And I'm going to talk all about that as we move along. Next slide, please. As that wonderful introduction, thank you, by the way, included, I had an incredible opportunity at the University of Michigan. At the University of Michigan, I did my undergrad in mechanical engineering with an electrical engineering minor, got my master's in systems engineering and design with an emphasis on space systems. And throughout all of that, had all these incredible professional opportunities. A lot of that is definitely thanks to SHIP and my involvement at the chapter, and nationally as well. But GE Aviation, SpaceX, Boeing, did some CubeSat work in grad school, and ultimately ended up on Mars 2020. And that was actually at a SHIP National Conference where I met my lead at the time, Eric Aguilar. If you guys went to the SHIP LA event last night, he was the main speaker. So it's so awesome that we shared all these platforms to talk about our experiences at JPL. And it's been nearly 5 years total involved with Mars 2020. And I'm going to get into all the details in just a few moments. But before I get to that, next slide, please. I've been involved in SHIP now for nearly 10 years, which kind of hit me the other day when I was putting this together. It's been about 10 years since I started. I started at Michigan in 2011. And right off the bat, that's where they picked me up. The SHIP chapter in Michigan was extremely warming to me. Arms wide open to make me part of the familia. And ever since then, I got involved locally from the get-go. Was an RLDC 6 chair. I became a VP external for a year. And I got involved in the region, and I got involved nationally as well. And I was in the board of directors, the national board of directors, for a year as a undergrad student representative. And over the years, right, with all of this, I've met people all over the country, had mentees and friends everywhere I go, which has been fantastic because no matter where I go, I never feel alone, right? Like that's been one of the big things with SHIP. And it's given me a wonderful opportunity to give back to my community and hopefully set an example and talk about how to get to all of these incredible places like JPL and work on these, interplanetary projects, right? Like that's what I'm all about. And I'm happy to share all my experiences. Most recently, I've been involved with NELA. So this year I will be involved with NELA once again as part of the planning committee. And I'm excited because of the new way we're splitting it up, where we're going to have a broad audience, and then we're going to split it into the chapter leaders. I think that's going to work out very well. I'm excited. Last year, for those of you that were there, I was one of the leads when it came out to the breakout sessions. So I put together a lot of that material. Over the years, I've taken different roles in NELA in particular, and I'm excited for what's to come. I became a SHIP Lifetime member in 2019. So of course, all of those here that can do that, obviously it's another way of giving back. And then of course, if you haven't just redone your membership, please do that as that's what I was saying in the beginning. So with that, that's a little bit of my involvement with SHIP. I want to get into the technical stuff here that you guys are here for, because we're going to spend some time, and hopefully you guys have some questions. Drop them in the chats. We'll be moderating as we go, depending on how the questions, how complicated they may be. Maybe I'll respond to them on the spot, or we'll wait to the end. But with that, vamos al mambo. That's my favorite saying. Next slide, please. All right, let's get right into it. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background with what Mars is about, because a lot of these missions, maybe we make it seem easy, but it's taken us many years and many failures as well to be able to get to Mars the way we do now and build on the knowledge across so many decades and so many engineers before us. Right off the bat, some of the big differences between Mars and Earth that maybe you may have not thought about before. Big thing, obviously, gravity is a third of what it is here. The atmosphere there is significantly thinner. It's about 1%. The gravity we have, the atmosphere that we have here. It's primarily composed of CO2. So obviously, if you and I were to stand on the surface of Mars, our lungs would not be able to actually breathe anything in because they're so tuned for Earth atmosphere. And obviously CO2 is not what we want as our primary ingredients. And it's very cold on Mars, and it has seasons as well. One lap around the sun, though, is about 2 Earth years. And that presents its own challenges, and we get to predict a little bit how that affects our environment and our temperatures. But more than anything, one of the biggest challenges, I think, for the humans on Earth is this concept that we have to work with of Mars time, okay? One of the biggest challenges with Mars, right? Depending where we are in orbit, depending how far we are, one-way light time, so how long it takes for a signal to go from here to Mars and from Mars here, takes between 6 to 20 minutes. Kind of depends where we are on orbit. And another big distinction with Mars is that a Martian soul, so a Martian day, that's how we like to refer to our days, takes about 24 hours and 40 minutes. All right, so 40 minutes different every single day on Mars. And what that did to us on Earth, particularly for the first around 70-something souls, we wanted to be able to command the spacecraft every single day after we landed to make sure that the health and safety were okay, and also to be able to commission a lot of our functions as we moved along. And to be able to do that, that meant that every morning on Mars, by 9 a.m. local Mars time, we had to be ready to uplink, to send sequences and commands to be able to perform those souls activities. Now, to be able to do that, that meant that we had to keep up this planning cycle every single day to be able to be ready by 9 a.m. local Mars time. And those 40 extra minutes on Mars meant that here on Earth, we were shifting our time 40 minutes every single day. So for us humans, that meant we were on a constant jet lag for nearly 3 months. And I'll get into this later, but my body hates me. And it was probably one of the most difficult things I've done professionally. And I'm one of the big reasons why I went to New York is to be able to take some time and spend some time with family, recover a little bit, to bring back some energy as the science mission is about to begin on Mars with Perseverance. Now that Ingenuity has completed its flights. So, and I'll talk about Ingenuity and the helicopter as well as we move along. So next slide, please. Before we get to Mars 2020, I like to highlight the fact that we've been on Mars for several decades. Right? We've been on Mars since the 1970s. The United States has been, anyways, where we sent the Viking landers, and we've had some constant presence. So we've been learning over time how to get to Mars, how to navigate through space, how to do entry, descent, and landing in different configurations depending on the payload, depending on the spacecraft we're sending. So we've had a combination of landers, which obviously don't have wheels. That's the big distinction. These are landers that are science labs that just plop somewhere on Mars for some particular interest, and they stay there. Late 1990s, we started developing the Sojourner rover, the Pathfinder mission, where we set out to try for the first time a rover on Mars, where we had to basically prove to ourselves that we can actually command a rover and use it to explore the Martian surface. Obviously, very different from a lander now that we can start moving around and potentially find sites of interest to do science. Over time, then, after we confirmed that happened, the Mars exploration rovers were completed, and that is what you guys may know as Spirit and Opportunity, which were designed both to operate for about 90 sols, 90 Martian days, and ultimately ended up lasting way more than that. Particularly Opportunity only stopped working in 2018, and that was about, I think, a 15-year journey, something like that. So that speaks for the level of engineering that we put into these rovers and the science that we do on Mars. And of course, a ton of scientific discoveries were done with that, and I'll get to that in a moment. Once we learned that we can do that, these rovers were about...
With those discoveries, Elio, this is Lázaro.
Yeah, go for it.
Does the gravity affect the architecture with all those landings that you've seen and the history that's been there? Have you guys seen any discoveries with regards to the effect gravity has in the structures? That's a question in the chat.
Gravity affects, of course, how we get to Mars. It helps us enough in a way because it's less gravity than on Earth. However, the atmosphere is really the big challenging thing because there's not enough atmosphere to be able to come down to the surface with a parachute. And I was going to get a little bit into this later as well. So as you may have seen in videos across time, many times, or really every single time, we've used some kind of propulsion system to take us to the surface to a certain height, nearly even to the surface of Mars. And that's because parachutes won't do the job all the way because the atmosphere is so thin. So gravity does help a bit, but not enough. Great question. So I think that's a particularly relevant question with what I was about to say. The Mars exploration rovers were about a golf cart sized type of rover. Sojourner before that was maybe the size of a microwave, and I have some pictures about this, so it's relatively small. And Curiosity and Perseverance are the size of a Mini Cooper. So significantly larger rovers, heavier, at the boundaries of our technological limits in terms of how much rockets, how many rockets and how much fuel we can send to Mars to be able to land safely on the ground and have those wheels touch down and do the job they need to do. And before I continue with that, I do want to highlight, of course, over decades, we've also sent these orbiters. So there's been these 3 type of vehicles that we've sent to Mars, and these orbiters primarily serve as our communication relays. That's how we have data communication, particularly for downlink. So when we try to extract data from our assets on Mars, these orbiters will pass overhead and collect some amount of data depending on the orbiter and shoot it back to Earth at a particular time. So with that being said, you guys can imagine we're not consistently talking with our assets on the ground. We have to send commands at a particular time and then also calculate about when we're going to receive data, and with that plan what data is critical, how to set priority of data, because for example, we want to make sure every single day that our engineering, health, and safety information is brought down to Earth, but maybe there's these large images and videos that we don't need immediately. So what we'll do is we'll chunk it out to send that information over time. So it provides kind of a challenge within itself to be able to operate on Mars consistently. So over time, in all of these different missions that we've developed, the increased level of automation, both from the rovers and the assets on the ground, as well as our ground systems here on Earth, have allowed us to cover more ground, do more science at the end of the day. And that's where we're moving towards with Mars 2020 and the Perseverance rover. And I'm going to talk about that in more detail. And now with that being said, we've had orbiters, we've had landers, we've had rovers, and as of last month, officially now we can conclude also that we've had aerial vehicles on Mars. So this is a new capability that we've proven we can use, and I'm going to talk about that as well and how I was involved in the mission. But now we have these 4 classes of vehicles we can use to explore the surface of Mars. So with that, next slide, please. This is a picture I wanted to show you, and also not only for the sizes, but to give you an idea of the budgets that we have to use for these kind of missions. Sojourner, the rover that we sent in the late 90s, first one of its kind as a technological demo, was about $200 million. From there, we moved on to Spirit and Opportunity, which were about $1 billion each. And then, or I think it was $1 billion total. So $500 million per rover. And then from there, Mars Science Laboratory, MSL, Curiosity, was about 2.5 billion, and Perseverance is about that same cost. And that's how much it costs to design, build, test, launch, and operate for its primary mission. So as long as these missions are successful, which they have been, Congress is happy, and they give us more money to be able to extend the missions as well. And that's something we have to negotiate as the timelines move along, and NASA gets involved with Congress, and our administrator then provides more funding to extend the missions and do more science and potentially start developing new missions for the future to continue. And we're going to get to that as well, what's coming after Mars 2020 and Perseverance. So this hopefully gives you guys an idea of the budgets and also the sizes, right? If you look at these pictures, those are some of my colleagues. They're about 6 foot tall or so. These rovers are relatively large. And the Perseverance rover, we'll get into the details and the fun facts, is the heaviest, largest rover we've ever sent, and most technologically complex as well. So let's talk about Perseverance. Next slide, please. Perseverance, the advantages that we take with Perseverance is that we built upon the Curiosity rover's architecture. So what do I mean by that? Is we took some of the, obviously the geometry, if you look at them side to side, they look very similar. And we also took some of the avionic core architecture and built it for Perseverance. The biggest differences are in the instruments and some of the mechanisms, because they're very different science missions. But relatively speaking, the power architecture is very similar. The weight class is very similar, and the geometry, as you see here, 10 foot long, by 9 feet wide, 7 feet tall, greater than 2,000 pounds. Another big difference I like to highlight is the RTG, that radiothermal isotope generator, which generates heat that is captured and converted into electricity, is the big difference between Perseverance and Curiosity and the previous rovers, which were powered by solar, or were charged up by solar panels. And the RTGs are providing consistent power supply to the batteries, so that, for example, what ended up happening with Opportunity, there was a planetary dust storm that covered the solar panels, which prevented the battery from recharging. Hence, that's why Opportunity ultimately failed. But with Curiosity, we didn't have that problem when that happened, because Curiosity has this massive nuclear reactor on it that doesn't depend on the sun. So this helps us navigate, throughout the Mars seasons as well, because that heat that we generate, we also have this complex set of thermal management and thermal equipment that uses that heat generated as well to pump fluid and control temperatures throughout the spacecraft. And we have heaters as well that help us control temperature where we need to do that. And that becomes important, as I'll discuss a little bit in my mechanical role. If it's too cold, too much current, you don't want that. So there is a lot of thermal management that goes into the vehicle. And some of the highlights here is that we have all these different instruments that I'll talk about what they do, and 23 cameras that include some of the entry, descent, and landing cameras, which I hope at this point you have seen videos and images of what was entry, descent, and landing, video and footage like we've never seen on Mars. We managed to capture and have it down here on Earth. There's something to that, which, when we talk with our vehicles, right, when we're hearing about them, mostly we see the numbers, we see what we call the telemetry, the messages that come from Mars. And there's definitely a different feeling when we get those images and those videos that kind of humanizes it in a way, because it puts those eyes, and now with Perseverance, also our ears, because we have microphones on board. So there's all these new different experiences we've been able to develop with Perseverance that we've never had on Mars. So it's been very exciting over the last few months. One of the additional big capabilities with Perseverance is that it's able to rove up to 200 meters a day. And to give you an idea, with Opportunity, we, over like 15 years, whatever it was, we covered about 24 kilometers, right? That's how much surface we covered. And now with Perseverance, we're able to cover up to 200 meters a day as soon as we develop a few additional capabilities, as I'll talk about, which is obviously way more efficient for us to be able to cover more ground, get to interesting scientific sites sooner, take more images, do more science, and help us meet our objectives. One big important distinction between Perseverance and Curiosity is that it has this complex robotic arm system you see in the front, which is the sample caching system. Robotic arm is part of the sample caching system. A big aspect of the mission is that, first of all, the sample caching system is by far the most complex robotic system we've ever flown in space. It is capable of collecting samples and storing them so that a later mission actually picks them up and brings them back to Earth. And I'll show you guys that architecture at the end of the presentation, but it's very important because, you know, these rovers are incredibly complex. They have these incredible suite of instruments that have spectroscopy, radar, all kinds of different techniques to explore Mars, but obviously they're still very limited in terms of power and functionality. So if we can bring samples back to Earth, we can do more conclusive science as to what we're observing on Mars. And I think, is there a question?
I have a couple of questions.
Oh, go for it.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So with the complexity and the need for power to be uninterrupted, and you mentioned the dust and coverage on some of them and how they fail. Has the consideration been made? And I'm assuming yes, but can you add windshield wipers to clean the solar panels? And if so, how would that be done? Or if it has been thought of, why hasn't it been implemented? And the other question is, after you answer that one, how many degrees of freedom does the pixel arm have?
Yeah, so this is a question that comes up often about the windshield wipers. It's generally not a significant problem to have dust accumulate on our solar panels. They don't necessarily degrade. So by the way, I want to highlight, right? Perseverance and Curiosity do not use solar panels at all. There's not a single one. Ingenuity does, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. The helicopter. Some of our landers, all of our landers have solar panels. But if you add, and this is where your trade studies come in. If you add a system that includes a windshield wiper, for example, that adds complexity that you have to test. You have to make sure it works no matter what. You have to come up with all the conditions in which something like that would fail. Would it get stuck on top of the solar panels? Does it make sense to use windshield wipers of sorts, or as a fan better, or whatever? I can't speak for the designers at the time. They decided for some reason not to use any kind of cleaning mechanism. There are winds as well on Mars, and we've seen some electromagnetic effects that kind of cleans off the solar panels, especially when dust bunnies pass by. They will clean off solar panels, so it's not necessarily as big as a problem, unless, of course, there's a massive planetary dust storm, which is what happened to Opportunity, which is a bigger problem where all the dust just kind of settled on top of the panels. But that's very rare. It doesn't generally happen on Mars. But actually, I don't know if any of you looked up looked up to the sky in 2018. I went to the Griffith Observatory when I was here, and a buddy of mine had a telescope pointed to Mars. You could see that the entire planet was just covered in dust. It was wild. And the next question, how many degrees of freedom does the pixel arm have? So the robotic arm is 6 actuators. It's so 6 degrees of freedom, and it's 6, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, it's 6 degrees of freedom, because then the turret has several as well, which does give a lot of flexibility and adds a lot of complexity. There's an entire group dedicated to the kinematics of the robotic arm, because obviously there are limitations in the geometry in which directions you can move the arm. How do you get to certain positions in a certain way? There's X amount of solutions kinematically to be able to translate your arm in a certain way or form. So there's an entire group dedicated specifically to the robotic arm because of all that complexity And of course, how do you use all the instruments in the on the turret as well, Sherlock, Pixel, to do all that contact science and also drill. There's a lot of complexity and a lot of testing over the years that I'll talk a little bit about.
And
great questions.
A little bit about the actual samples that are collected and that are brought back to Earth, because you mentioned earlier the atmosphere in Mars is a little bit different, 1/3 of what we have here on Earth. When the samples actually get back to Earth, do they actually get compromised when we open it here?
So great question. That is definitely, we have an entire group, planetary protection group, dedicated to thinking about how we're going to do sample handling when those samples come back. Talk a little bit about that at the end of the presentation, but basically what I'll start with in regards to that is that we have experience as an organization. NASA brought samples from the moon. We had all these same thoughts back in the 60s and 70s when we were bringing samples from the moon, because we don't actually know if we're bringing back some kind of microorganism, right? Like, we have to be very conscious of bringing back something that could harm life on Earth. So with that being said, there's all kinds of cleanliness requirements we develop also for all of the material that gets sent to Mars, and the sampling mechanisms and the sample tubes we use. There's a high degree of care that's taken before we launch. And similarly, once we return these samples to Earth, which is going to happen maybe within a decade, we're going to have locations where these samples are going to be handled so that nothing can leave these sites, right? That's going to be very important. So great question, and I'll get into the details of that a little later as well.
With that, you mentioned the nuclear power on the Perseverance.
That's right.
Is that, how long is that expected to last? And are there certain mechanisms and instruments prioritized to continue functioning when the power is not sufficient for the entire rover?
So just to give you an idea, we launched. This is a great question, by the way. I'm not a power expert, so I don't have a straight answer for you. I'm not a nuclear engineer either. But all I know is that Curiosity has been on the surface of Mars since 2012 and is still operating nominally, doing all kinds of science. So I don't expect the degradation to really take hold and becoming a problem for maybe for decades at a time. I don't know, is what I'll say. I don't know. I can get back to you. There may be information on this online, but obviously also keep in mind, this is like nuclear information, so you may not find the details you want. The radiothermal isotope generator is handed to us by the Department of Energy. So there's a lot of constraints with what information's out there as well.
Great. So we have about 15 minutes before we actually get to the Q&A. So let's allow Elio to continue. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Elio.
let's get right through it, because I only have a few slides to finish up. So next slide, please. Those are instruments, everything I've mentioned. There's 4 objectives we want to accomplish, particularly in the first 2 Earth years of Perseverance. Number 1, we're going to continue studying the geology of Mars, right? At the end of the day, the rover is a geologist with some very fancy instrumentation. Objective B is we want to find biosignatures. This is the first time, right? Over time, with the different rovers and the different assets we've had on the ground, we've confirmed that there's water on Mars, that at some point there were, the temperature may have been perfect. We've confirmed organic material on Mars. We've never confirmed whether or not that organic material is a result of biological processes, or more than likely they're geological. But with the instruments that we have on board Perseverance, we're going after biosignatures to see if what we're observing on Mars truly is of extraterrestrial life in some way or form. A big aspect to that is going to be the sample caching, which I briefly mentioned. Is we're going to do some preliminary science with the instruments on board. At the end of the day, though, we're going to put whatever the scientists think is interesting enough in these sample tubes that are going to eventually be picked up and brought back to Earth for further studies. Another big aspect of the mission is the prepare for humans. You may have heard over the last month, we use the instrument MOXIE, which allows us to convert the local carbon dioxide into oxygen, which is obviously going to be important for human exploration, both for a survival standpoint and also to generate fuel on Mars to bring those astronauts back home. Now, with MOXIE in particular, I think we can generate about 10 grams of oxygen per 6 hours. So more than anything, it's a technological demo for us to understand that we can do it. But obviously, 10 grams per 6 hours is not going to be enough. More complex systems are going to have to be generated and developed for whenever the humans get to the surface of Mars. So those are our primary objectives. Next slide, please. Now, we're just beginning our science mission, which is going to last about 2 years total. As I'll talk in the next slide, but before we get there, we've been focusing on the early commissioning of instruments, mechanisms, cameras, and completing the Ingenuity technical demo, making sure that we could fly on Mars, which we did. Spoiler alert. So I'll talk a little bit about that next. But now we're going to focus on the contact science, identifying the samples we want to bring back to Earth. Now, I do want to highlight some of these images that I have here. Bottom, that's a picture, first of all, on the top of where we landed on Mars, this Jezero crater. Jezero crater, if you look at it, right, it's almost obvious that at some point in time, water flowed through those features. Like you can see that there's some kind of formation where some form of water flowed through it. If you look at it and look at the images online, it's very much akin to the Mississippi Delta. And we know where there's water, there's life here on Earth. So over time, we think that if there is anything preserved, Jezero crater was selected as one of the prime candidates to identify, whatever life forms, if there were any at any point in time, may be in this area. Now, Mars 2020 and Perseverance had these incredible systems that allowed us to have this very precise landing that is unprecedented to the degree at which we accomplished it, which is also feeding to the lunar program and forward. So a lot of the technology we developed to land on Mars with Mars 2020 is feeding other programs in the future. So I invite you guys once again, look at the video. That image we're looking at the bottom right is of one of the cameras as from the video where the rover descended to the surface of Mars, which was incredible. Once we got it on the ground, I'll tell you, we were jumping up and down screaming because at first we only saw the first images, which one of the first images is in the bottom left there. But then once we got videos over the next few weeks of what we had accomplished on Mars, it was just a new feeling. It was crazy at the end of the day. So with that, yeah, Jezero crater, the fun fact is that we can see rocks there that are up to 3.6 billion years old, which is around the time where we think here on Earth is when life started. So we want to see whether or not life started there as well. And if not, or if it did, why did it differ so much with what happened here on Earth? So many exciting questions to be answered. Now, next slide, please. Big aspect of the mission, at least personally, and obviously for many technical reasons, with Ingenuity, we accomplished our first powered flight in another world. Tiny little helicopter. The top picture right there is of it flying. The bottom picture is from the rover looking at it closely. You can see some dust there, and I'll talk about that in the solar panels. So that was a good question. Going back to that first question, prove to us that we can fly on Mars. This gives us the capability now to develop missions that instead of sending rovers, we may want to send a swarm of drones or more complex drones to do science from this new aerial capacity. And at this point, the technical demo, which was basically, hey, can you even fly on Mars? We succeeded. We succeeded with 5 flights. And I invite you all to look up the videos because they're fantastic. Each flight more complex than the previous one. And now we're moving on to the operational demonstration, which is how do we add value to the scientific mission of Mars 2020 by using a helicopter? How can we scout new sites for scientific interests? Or can we actually use the images from Ingenuity to do science and identify features that may be interesting and the such? Some fun facts there of Ingenuity. The one I want to talk a little bit about is, you can see those, the dust on top of the solar panels in the image. And the cool thing is with flying is that as soon as you fly, the dust cleans itself off. So we saw our solar panels in a way overperform from expected models a little bit. So from a power system perspective, Ingenuity has been doing very well. from a thermal management perspective. It's been able to survive the really cold Martian nights, which we were worried about, which is a huge feature. And of course, take those flights, which have been constrained to about 90 seconds or so. We actually, I think, did a little bit more. We did 120 seconds for one of them. The flights have been between 5 to 10 meters. And I think the round trip for the longest one we've had so far was about 200 meters, a little more than 200 meters. But obviously we can cover a good amount of ground, and we can communicate from the rover, because something to be mindful of is that we communicate from our orbiters to the rover and from the rover to the helicopter. So that adds a layer of complexity there that we have to be mindful of. So it's distance dependent. And we have seen a really good performance in our communication systems. So we can communicate. The requirement was between 100 and 100 meters and a kilometer away. But we think we can push the limits of that a little bit. So we're going to see that over the next few weeks. So with that being said, that was Ingenuity. I'm going to talk a little bit about the details of what I did in a moment. Next slide, please. But before we get to that, Mars sample return. I want to show you this image, because the next thing we want to do about Mars sample return or on Mars is going to be to collect those samples. And the added complexity there is that we're going to have to launch from Earth, right? Launch from Earth, cruise through space, get to Mars. Once we get to Mars, go fetch samples. Once we have those samples, launch from Mars, and launching from Mars and then capturing whatever we're going to pick up from some orbiter on Mars and then bring that back to Earth. So something we've never done before, arguably the most complex mission we're going to fly in the next decade or so, which is really exciting for NASA and all of our partners. So, and then of course, once we get all those samples on Earth, who knows what we're going to conclude from them. So next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk about what I've done for a quick minute here. If you guys are interested in asking questions about this as well, as a system test bed engineer, which is mostly my primary role over the last few years, I've had the opportunity of working with several systems, including the remote sensing mast, which is the head, the high gain antenna, which is the antenna that permits us to communicate directly to the rover in both directions, the engineering cameras, which took some of those first images, which was a very proud moment for me, the motor controller, which controls obviously all of the actuators on the rover. It's one of my primary roles now as well, the Mars helicopter system. And early on, I did avionics, thermal control, and wake up and shut down behaviors, which is very complex on its own. Over time, that meant I became an expert in integrating systems and debugging them, looking at signals, signal processing, functional tests to check out our initial capabilities. And on top of that, then became then came the system level verification and validation. Certain behaviors that, go do the requirement gathering, test those requirements, test against those requirements, perform data reviews, show that those capabilities exist. And if they didn't, are there bugs? How do we fix them? Can we fix them in time before launch? Is it a hardware problem? Once we've launched, everything can only be fixed through software updates. Develop the flight rules, which are the operational guidelines, what can and cannot be done on Mars. And one of my biggest contributions before we landed on Mars were what we call surface operational readiness test, which at that point, we've tested most of the spacecraft and we know the spacecraft works. Now, the next part of that is, how do we test the humans that are going to operate the spacecraft? We want to make sure the humans were ready to go with our ground tools to analyze the data and prepare for all the planning that's involved. Now, with that being said, I've done a lot of tool development. I do a lot of Python. As a mechanical engineer, I learned on the job, and that's been one of my most valuable skills, and done a lot of test automation. One of the things I'm very proud of is I like to make myself replaceable. And if I can develop tools that are going to make my life as well as my teammates' lives easier, I'm going to do that because I think it's important for the organization. And with that being said, let's look at the next slide. So I think I'm close to finishing up here. Now I am mostly involved in engineering operations. So primarily as a mechanisms chair, where I analyze motor controller data and our actuator performance for several mechanisms. And the big thing is really determining whether or not it's safe for us to plan for the next sol, to make sure that everything is still good to go, that our performances are well, we haven't sent too much current to an actuator, things are warm enough or cold enough to be able to be used safely, and understand and trend data so that over time we can see any kind of performance degradation or improvements for whatever reason, and stay on top of issues more than anything. I had the privilege over the last month to also be part of the helicopter tactical downlink and uplink team. And something I'm going to take to the grave is that I was the person that set the alarm that woke up the helicopter for its first flight. So that was my product, and it was awesome. With that being said, I worked on processing that data that came down from the helicopter, bringing in the respective teams to look at the data, make sure that our flights, our communications were okay, so that then we can continuously, once again, plan an uplink for the next day, the new sequences and commands, which include communication with the rover, holding energy, so just basically turning on, sending us some telemetry to make sure we're okay, and continuously charge and have the heaters turn on at the right time so that the battery didn't freeze up over time, particularly during the Martian nights. And of course, send the flight sequences that a lot of the teams, that the avionics team and the guidance and navigation team delivered to us. So those were very, very critical, and honestly, huge honor to have been working with that team for the last month. That picture in the bottom right is my absolute favorite picture of the mission, which was a selfie from the rover taken next to Ingenuity, which was awesome. And then, of course, on top is a selfie of me when I was mech chair and the rest of the helicopter team that was also there. So that was on my birthday a few weeks ago, which was really cool. And next slide, I think we're almost done here. I wanted to touch upon a few things. I know a lot of folks may be undergrads or early career hires, such as myself. We can talk about this in detail if you guys have more questions about it too. Something that has helped me in terms of advancing my career, I think self-awareness has been key. And I keep coming back to this over the last month in particular. Kind of what I was touching upon was with Mars time and how difficult it was to manage my health and my emotionally and physically. It made me more conscious that I can't take that stuff for granted, right? So being aware of your own limits, setting boundaries is important, particularly what I like to say, and this does come from a particular resource, your emotional, physical health, your work, right? Whether or not you build gauges for these things to know whether or not you feel like you're doing well in all of them, your financial health, your play, what you do for fun and what you love and the people you work with and the relationships that you have, both family, friends, romantic or not. All these things are important. So, make sure you keep tabs on all of it, whatever works for you. I do think that you need to find whatever balance is best. And honestly, I'm working on it because I have to admit, right? Personally, I've had to make a lot of sacrifices to work on this mission over the last few years, and something I'm continuously getting better at. And I share that with folks, so folks also become mindful of these things, right? And establishing what your values are, what your personal mission is. Does the work and all the things I just mentioned align with all of that, right? Ultimately makes you happy. And think long-term, always think long-term. Surround yourself by incredible people, what I call here your advisory board. Something I'm extremely proud of since high school is that I've always surrounded myself by people that push me to be better, and similarly people that I push to be better. And that creates a really good dynamic and a support network. And also SHIP obviously has done a lot of that for me, and you guys are here for a reason. And I hope you guys continue. And then rather than just think 5-year plans, 2-year plans, whatever it is, I like this Odyssey plans terminology from one of the resources in the bottom, where it's all about constant prototyping and testing and iterating and figuring out what you like. You can't think so far in the future always. Maybe you can, maybe you're special. That may line up for some people. I will say that for me, it's been more of looking out and seeking out for opportunities that made sense at the time to develop into, and proceeding to do my best. And it has worked out very well. And most of my mentors that are involved in Department of Defense and all kinds of government jobs and also in corporations and industry have that constant message. There's only so much you can plan in the future, but always make sure to do your best. With that, some resources here. There are some of my favorites to look into that I kind of abide by in many ways. Start with Why and the Infinite Game by Simon Sinek, some of my favorite books. How to Win Friends and Influence People, classic from the early 1900s, which still very much relevant today. by Dale Carnegie. Something I'm currently working on is a book called Design Your Life by Bill Burnett and Dave Evans, professors at Stanford, which put a lot of these ideas that I put in the top together and formalize them in a way. And getting things done is a method I use to do my priority management. I think a big distinction from undergrad to professional life, from undergrad and grad school, from academia really, is that back then you can master time management, and I think you can do very well in school. Now, at least for me, it became more of priority management. What really matters at what time, and being able to negotiate things and move things around. It's something you can't necessarily do in school, but now as a professional, that's really what has defined the way I operate day to day. So that being said, those are some of my own tools and my own little pieces of advice. Hopefully they're useful, maybe not. I'm open ears as well to any advice you may have for me. And, I'm going to open it up to questions if there's any. Thank you guys for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Elio. Before I forget, can we go ahead and take the presentation off so that we can take a quick group photo? So for posterity.
Sure.
Yeah, before I forget, because I normally will forget. So, Saul, I know that I asked you earlier. Thank you so much for remembering. Can we go ahead and have the group picture?
Yeah, sure thing. All right. Make sure you guys' cameras are already on if you want to be part of it.
Yeah. Let us know when you're ready. Can you get all 49 or 40 people in there? Is that something that you can do?
Yeah, it's one screen. Yeah.
Okay, great. Awesome.
All right. 1, 2.
Cool.
All right, got it.
Thank you. Now for the Q&A section, this is the official Q&A section. I know that Kevin Fitzpatrick, you had a question. You mind opening your mic and actually bringing that up?
Yeah. Let's see. It's my understanding that radiation beyond low Earth orbit is increased. It's different. There's heavier radiation. Did this play into any of the engineering or expectations of the Mars missions?
Great question. Yes, radiation is one of the big aspects when you consider the environment in which you have to operate spacecraft. Low Earth orbit is actually one of the most radiation intensive places near Earth anyways. A lot of high energy particles do concentrate in our ionosphere. So devices, if you put your iPhone on low Earth orbit, it's going to fry instantly, to give you an idea, right? Which is, I think, a reason why it may seem backwards, but a lot of the technology we use for flying into space is like 1980s, 1990s computer architectures. They were clunkier, they were bigger components, transistors were beefier, and are less sensitive to high energy particles. Similarly on Mars, I will say this. A key aspect to Ingenuity, okay? Ingenuity, not only did it perform these incredible flights on Mars, it did also use commercially off-the-shelf components. So there is a Snapdragon processor, one of the first ones, I think, from like about a decade ago, is what we use as the core avionics system for Ingenuity, which runs a Linux operating system. And, for many years, we've been using other technology on Mars that is, 1980s architecture. And all of a sudden, we're using commercially off-the-shelf components on Mars. That can potentially open up new mission architectures and a lot of cost savings. So every time we do these missions, right, these tech demos, we try and push these limits that we believe exist, like radiation. Radiation on Mars is significantly higher. There's less of an atmosphere. It's also obviously going to be a problem for humans when they get there, which is why I believe our first settlements they're going to have to be underground to have that barrier that protects people. So we're many centuries away from a colony, in my opinion, in my humble opinion. But radiation is difficult, is what I will say, and that's a great question. Another really good example, if you're interested in radiation in particular, go look up the Jupiter missions. Jupiter is by far the most radiation intensive planet we explore, because of how big it is and how it attracts and keeps radiation from the sun. And those are really important considerations when we send missions to Jupiter and its moons. So I invite you to go explore a little bit into that. So hopefully this gives you ideas.
Awesome. Thank you. Does that answer your question, Kevin?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Moving on, Kaleo and Juan had a question. You mind opening up your mic and asking it yourself?
Sure. We were just curious about the rovers. I'm sorry if it sounds kind of ignorant, but the rovers left there on Mars after the missions are terminated. I know some of them are there for quite a few years. And then when you talked about these new rovers being powered by a nuclear reactor, does that pose a potential problem with, leftover waste or nuclear, fuel power there left on the planet?
Whenever that first government shows up on Mars, they may be able to give us a massive ticket for all of the waste we're leaving behind. But I mean, yeah, we leave these rovers behind. Like all these assets stay there. Nothing can pick them up. I mean, there's always this joke that if you want to go pick up this unused parachute, you can go to Mars and pick it up, and it's fantastic. These materials are there up for grabs if people want to use them. But it's going to be many years before human presence is on Mars. But, I think maybe, eventually we're going to build like memorials around these things, right? Like once we get to Mars, we're going to build these sites where like, here's the first rover that got to Mars, or here's one of the first landers, just like we have here on Earth, right? We're going to build these really cool museums. Who knows? I mean, many decades in the future, but yes, they stay on Mars.
And Elio, I know you mentioned you wanted to leave at about 8 o'clock. So the clock is at 8. And I'm just going to ask one last question here, or unless you want to stay a little longer.
We can stay till 8:15. That's okay.
Oh, okay.
I figured that would happen.
Okay, then we're going to go back to Scott. You have a question here. Who is on the team helping to prep having humans on Mars? What kind of engineers are doing that? Is that your question, Scott?
Yes. I'm just asking because I'm a bioengineer, so that's a question that I'm interested in a little bit, because it's not rocket-based, it's human-based a little bit more.
But it is rocket
right.
Science, so.
Yeah, true. Space science.
Well, great question. So JPL focuses on the robotic exploration of the universe. If you're looking for human exploration of the universe, that's mostly from Houston. And, officially we don't have any kind of mission going to Mars anytime soon, but we do have the Artemis program, right? There's the next big step for human exploration is getting back to the moon and establishing long-term presence there. That's going to teach us a ton, which is a lot of information we will need to develop to ultimately end up being able to go to Mars and beyond. So that's very exciting. And, we'll see what happens on the commercial side. When all these billionaires want to get to Mars, I worry that the people lose a sense of safety with a lot of the narratives that are being put out there. Back in the 1960s, in the 1970s, a lot of people died, right? Because of the way we were conducting our testing. The Russians killed even more people in their own space race, and we will never know probably what the Soviets' losses were like. But now that we're more conscious about human life, I would hope people should never take safety for granted, and we should not be pushing timelines just to have that first tweet or Instagram or whatever. Safety for humans is going to be critical, I think, and a lot of engineering and thought has to be put in place. We'll see where we're at with the commercial side of things over the next decade. But there's going to be a massive partnership for sure with NASA and whoever decides to get to Mars and other places as well. Because at the end of the day, the United States government is who grants permissions for people that end up getting into orbit. So exciting, but also I want to keep people kind of grounded on the sense of, what should we push for, right?
Awesome. Thank you for that insight there, Elio. And that's very true. Safety should always be a top priority for everyone. We have a question from Luis Rivero. Do you mind opening your mic, Luis?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Elio, I am fascinated by nuclear power. How I know that on Earth you can't have something for nothing. How do you replenish and keep the nuclear power plant going?
You don't.
Through?
You don't. You don't. So it does have a half-life. So ultimately, those nuclear powers are going to just die. When is that going to happen? I honestly don't know. But you don't replenish them over time. They will generate less heat. We will be able to. We'll have less heat to convert to electricity. But I think we're many years out from that on Mars with the specific needs we have for perseverance and ingenuity. For perseverance and curiosity.
Okay, awesome.
We'll see. That's the best I can say.
Awesome. We have a question from Luis Calle. Luis, do you mind opening your microphone and asking the question yourself?
Yeah. Elio, you mentioned that the next mission is going to be Mars sample return. Are there any other future Mars missions past that point? Or is JPL going to focus more on other bodies in the solar system like Europa?
All TBD, right? There's nothing official out there. The next mission is going to happen officially right now is slated, I think, to launch something like 2026. I don't even know if it's official actually. But Mars sample return has a few years to go. And typically what defines the missions that NASA goes after is what we call the decadal survey. The decadal survey happens every 10 years. And I think the last one happened in I think it was last year, actually, in 2020. It's basically a conference of scientists decides what questions are important to answer for the next decade. And depending on the next decade and what those questions are, then there's going to be announcements of opportunities for missions and different principal investigators to submit proposals. And then ultimately NASA decides which missions get funded. That being said, your vote matters on this kind of stuff. If you want to see more exploration, you have to figure out which people support expanding the NASA budget, and hopefully we'll see more space exploration down the line. And both Democrat and Republican have been very successful in supporting the space program over the last few years. So I figure it's going to expand as the commercial side of things also grows. It clearly shows that expanding the NASA side is critical for external to Earth exploration. So we'll see where we go.
Awesome. Great question. Great response. We have a question from Daniel Campas. Do you mind opening up your microphone?
Yeah. So Elio, you mentioned how the Mars helicopter essentially just shakes off dust with its rotor once it's on the surface. How do landers and rovers usually deal with that dust, trying to get into different mechanism joints, like camera lenses, and essentially trying to compromise the functionality of the whole system?
Fantastic question. We design the actuators to keep out dust, is what I will say. So we don't necessarily worry too much about dust getting into our actuators. Most systems, we design them with that in mind. Things like lenses, there are specific lenses, particularly on the head of the rover, for example. When we're done for the day, we'll put it in a position that we think minimizes dust accumulation. But I imagine also that there's protective coatings that prevent dust from sticking. And so far, that hasn't ever really been a problem with Perseverance or Curiosity. I don't know before that, honestly. But we do consider all these things in how we design our mechanisms and such. Good question.
We have a question from Dimas. Do you mind opening up your mic and asking the question, sir?
Yeah, hi. About the database, which one do you use, Oracle or MySQL?
We typically use Amazon Web Service, at least for now, for many database. Yeah, it just kind of depends. The answer just kind of depends. We use things as Elasticsearch. There probably is some MySQL somewhere, but it just kind of depends on what subsystem you're talking about and who's collecting the data and for what. we try it all, is what I'll say.
Great.
Okay, so that confirms what I heard, that Amazon government had a contract.
Well, this is Amazon government. You're thinking about probably the latest defense contract. We're not considered under that. So we go and buy whatever product is important for us, and we just kind of
Okay.
go with what's best.
We
Yeah,
have
there's a lot of
another
we use a
question.
lot of we use a lot of open source and off the shelf stuff. But
We have
I mean,
a
great
question
question.
from Albert. Albert, can you open up your mic and ask your question, sir?
Sure. Yeah, I had a bit of a career question. So
Yeah, go for it.
at JPL, is there anything only a PhD can do that someone with a master's degree can't?
We have technical experts, I will say, people that are very specialized on particular topics. If that's what you're asking, I mean, that's at the end of the day what runs the lab, is the research side of things. I don't know how else to answer the question. Hopefully that answers the question.
Sort of, yeah. I just basically wanted to know if someone were to not decide to get their PhD, if going in with their master's degree and then specializing from there, can that sort of like supplement for not having a PhD?
I mean, Exhibit A, you're looking at them. I don't have a PhD. Right? Many people don't have PhDs, and I'll take a few steps back. Right, you go get a PhD if there's a topic out there that you're passionate about, and that you know you're going to have a fantastic time dedicating your 5 years or whatever it is going after it, and then potentially applying that elsewhere. Also, like if you don't know what that topic may be yet, you can always push that off to start it later, right? I hope you're not feeling pressure to get a PhD for one reason or another. However, I will say this is also another important aspect, especially for the community here, to work at a place like JPL. And if you're undocumented, you need a PhD. There's just no way around it, if at all, because we do have international students that ultimately get hired full-time, but because they have PhDs and they're specialized in something that we can't find a US citizen or a US person as a replacement for. So if you're an international student or undocumented, that would be the way into NASA and JPL. Otherwise, it's very difficult. So I'll add that for folks if that's relevant.
Quick question for you from my side. You're working at JPL, NASA. You're working with the Perseverance rover, Perseverance rover, and you're at the top of the game. And everybody seeing you, watching you, is like, how did you get that job? But my question is not that. My question is, when you were in high school, or at least entering college, did you envision yourself where you're at this moment?
Absolutely. 100%. I think it was never a question. It was a matter of when it was going to happen for me. And that comes, I think, from the support and love I had from my mom. I grew up in a single mother household. She was a teacher. I saw her sacrifice a lot, working a ton when we moved to the United States, continental US anyways. And it was always a question. It was never a question whether or not I was going to go to college. It was my passion the entire time that I wanted to go get involved in aerospace in one way or another. And my high school story is interesting from many reasons, but I had a wonderful support system from my teachers. I went to public school, and also my friends. And again, it comes back to that piece of advice I gave earlier, is that I always had people pushing me to be better. And so to this day, I love to claim this because there is some truth to it. Some of my best friends, I like to say that I'm the dumb one of the group. My friends are getting their PhDs, their MBAs, they're starting up companies, and that drives me, right? There is a certain level of drive that comes from being surrounded by people that do that and have that kind of focus, that are ambitious in a certain way, in a healthy way, and it's been my drive ever since high school, right? So I think for me, it was a matter of when, to be honest. I envisioned myself, and I mean, I worked my butt off, right? And I've surrounded myself by mentors. I will never claim that I did this on my own. That would be an absolute lie. I've had an incredible support network, and through SHIP and through my colleagues and my friends, Michigan, and it's worked out very well. I think there's a sense of trust with me as well that I have a lot of pride in the way I approach my teams and my teammates, and then working with people that has opened a lot of opportunities. So with that being said, that's a few pieces of information from my story there.
Awesome. And we have about, we're at 8:15 right now. So if you have, I know that you mentioned you can stay until 8:15. So definitely appreciate your time, Elio. Thank you so much. With that, I applaud you and acknowledge you for your time here, sir. For the rest of us here, hopefully someday you can come without really a schedule conflict and do another presentation for the chapter. Definitely invite you and extend the invitation for you. So we'll definitely be in touch. But for the meantime, thank you so much. Definitely appreciate everything you've shared with us. I know that everybody here loved hearing about the Perseverance rover and everything that it entails to get to work at JPL and your guidance to do that. Thank you so much, Elio. Thank you so much.
Hey, seriously, thank you guys for having me. Connect with me on social media, LinkedIn. Hopefully I'll see a few of you at NELA, National Conference and the such. And I mean, as things start opening up, maybe I'll go to San Diego and I'll let you guys know too. If you guys are ever in LA, reach out. I'm here. So, gracias, familia.
Gracias, Elio. Buenas noches.